the Heat for something, okay, if you want to blame the Heat for something, and people I know are going to blame them for not putting enough talent around him. They're going to blame him for Pat's comments, which I understand that to a degree. But to me, the biggest mistake they made was thinking that they could control this situation with an uncontrollable player.
Yeah.
That is the biggest mistake. Now, people are going to say, okay, they should have traded him. Now, I can tell you, they say, and again, we've done enough podcasts now that I get responses to all this stuff. So I'm just giving you what they say. It does not mean necessarily they listen to everything. I'm not saying that this is necessarily accurate. I'm saying this is what they say. They did not have any offers for him last summer. That the Philadelphia thing, and we had Vinny on the podcast, we had on 5 on the Floor, that there was no offer from Philadelphia at all at the time. Okay. And they had Paul George walking into cap space. So they didn't have to pay anything additional but the contract for him, whereas they would have with Jimmy. So the thing is, everybody's like, well, you should have traded him. And the Heat are like, well, we didn't have any offers for him. And I've made the case that if they had traded him at that point, the fan base, the casual fan base, not the ones who are following you or me or off the floor, would have gone nuts. Why are you trading Jimmy Butler now? Like, I mean, he got hurt. He got hurt in the play-in game. Why? It would not have played well. All right. But I understand to a certain degree, okay, why fans are saying if you weren't going to pay him, then you should have looked to move him. Then they would have had to have been aggressive trying to move him. And I don't know what offer they would have gotten. There was nothing that came in from anybody else. There were people in his camp who apparently teams reached out to and said, if they don't want Jimmy, we'll take him. Well, that's not an offer, though.
Do we know who they are?
That's interest. I think Philly was one. But I think Philly was one. I don't know who the other ones were, but I think Philly was one. I have a hunch on one of the others. It's one of the 3 teams that Jimmy meant that was mentioned by Shams originally.
That probably
but I don't. There was no offer made. There was no dialogue or discussion because the Heat believed, and I understand why they would believe this when they were dealing with if they were dealing with the run of the mill star, okay, in terms of personality, that Jimmy Butler had a motivation to come back and play well and a lot. And the motivation was the potential for money at the end of the season. Something happened where he didn't want to wait for it because I know that the Heat were open to the conversation. Now, they never made an offer to his people. But they can't. The only thing they could offer was this one extension, which is basically ripping up the contract for next year, giving him an additional $3 million, and then giving him 58 the next year. So you're talking about $61 additional million, right? That's what they could do, which would have kept him here through 2020 until 2026, which, by the way, is when everybody wants to get off clean anyway.
Right.
Okay. So they could have offered him that. I was 60-40 against it. I was not strongly against it. I understood why the Heat wanted to wait, see if he plays more, see if he's more motivated in the games he plays. It wasn't just that he only played 60 games last year. There were about 15 games he took off. Okay. I mean, he just took off. He'd be in the game, be like, did he play tonight? Especially against the good teams. He only shot 43% last season. Not this season. He's been better this season, actually. But last season, he shot 43% against top 10 defenses, and he averaged under 18 points. That is not a player you max, okay? It's just not. So I understand why they wanted to see him perform at a certain level. They thought he would be motivated to play at that level. They thought they were going to get contract year Jimmy. All right. And I think that he came into the season open to that, and then things flipped. And I don't think it was role. I just think it was frustrating. I think personally, and I know people are saying he was trying to protect his body. It looked like he sprained his ankle. He had 3 other injuries. I understand all that. But I think it was just that he just got tired of waiting, got tired of the whole thing, Pat not being communicative on it, frustrations. Remember, the initial Shams report about how he would not take an extension even if offered. Remember that one? That was on draft night. You know what else happened on draft night?
They extended.
Bam was extended.
Yep. And before that, there was the noise about, hey, he wants the extension. And then it came out that there was not going to be an offer. Then it's like, oh, well, we didn't want it anyway. That's right. Where this started really getting funky. There's a couple of other things, and then I want to get to comments and then the main question of all this. But
keep the main thing.
There's a couple of sliding doors moments, I feel like, with this organization too, along they didn't get Jimmy enough help, this discourse, if you will. The Victor Oladipo one, I feel like we don't talk about enough, because what if he doesn't absolutely blow up his leg 4 games into that season after they traded for him? because we talk about like, oh, the Derek White potential acquisition and those level of role players. And I feel like, what if the Oladipo thing worked out a lot sooner and he just didn't get hurt every time or every season seemingly? Like, that's one thing. I don't know how impactful he actually would have been, but we saw flashes of him actually being a really good perimeter defender in their system. Now, there's a world where he makes too much money after that and they're not able to do what they did that offseason. But I think about that a little bit more probably than the average person, because in order to extend your window, you have to win around the margins. And that was a deal where it's like Kelly Olynyk, Avery Bradley, and like a bullshit first. And it was like you had Oladipo in there, but he got hurt after 4 games. And then Kyle Lowry was, people forget, because I'm going to make this point all the time. No, Kyle Lowry wasn't amazing. He was fine the first year, but he was the number 1 free agent off the board that year in terms of a guy who switched teams.
And then the number one one that Jimmy Butler wanted.
And in the
beyond
GM survey,
wanted, almost demanded.
Yeah, and in the NBA GM survey, the answer for who is the player that's going to make the most impact on their new team or whatever, it was Kyle. Who's the team that had the best offseason?
And to some degree, it was the Heat. And to some degree, he did. And we have to give Kyle some credit here, because Kyle helped carry them in a season where Jimmy and Bam missed a lot of time and they got to the 1 seed. I'm not going to diminish Kyle's accomplishments there. But, okay, Kyle dropped off. His attitude was not good from the beginning. He was, the way that
even
the
in the
office
first
describes
year,
it, he did not want to be there almost from moment 1 when he started to figure out what Heat culture represented. Okay. So he was not, you know what it was similar to in a lot of ways? It was similar to Dwayne in Chicago. Okay. It was similar to Dwayne in Chicago. Like, Dwayne was used to the way that the Heat did things. And then he went to Chicago and he was like, Dwayne was done. I talked to Dwayne when he was up in Chicago. He was done within like week 1. Okay. Because it wasn't the Heat way. Well, Kyle was used to the way the Raptors did things. The Raptors catered to him in a certain way. The Heat don't do that necessarily. Now, Dwayne grew up in it. So that's different. Okay. So Dwayne understood it. And that's why during the Big 3 era, Dwayne was the one who kept LeBron in check. Okay. If you remember the initial press conference at the Heck Center in Miami, LeBron sat there the whole time tapping his fingers. Okay. Dwayne sat between Bosh and LeBron. Dwayne had the mic. Dwayne controlled it. The reason things fell apart in the last year with the Heat, and I covered every game, home and road. Okay. The reason that it fell apart for the Heat in that last year, 13-14, was because Dwayne was not available enough. And LeBron, and again, I have a lot of respect for LeBron and the way he operates and works. Okay. But without Dwayne as a buffer like that year, and LeBron was frustrated. LeBron would find out from us that Dwayne wasn't playing and Tony Douglas was starting. That's the real reason things fell apart in that last year. Okay. and Odin
Tony
and
Douglas
Beasley.
Tony Douglas, I tried to get an autograph from him when I was a teenager and I was like 16, and he said he'd be back, and I'm still waiting. You know what I mean?
Well, you can keep waiting. I don't think he's coming.
That was he was with the Knicks.
Right. So the point is, like, they like, Dwayne kept that stuff, but Dwayne was used to the way the Heat operated. Like, the reason LeBron talked to the media twice a day is because that's what Dwayne did. Okay. Kyle came down here and didn't like the way that the Heat operated almost from day 1. Now, he played well enough in the first year, but the way that the Heat describe it is that, again, it always comes down to it. You can have one guy who's kind of difficult, but you can't give him a buddy. And right. Jimmy, the stuff that started happening behind the scenes with Jimmy really started after Kyle came. Okay. And you're going to hear more about it because a lot of this is going to get aired now, because if it goes to arbitration, and there's a lot behind the scenes. I'm not saying this to disparage Jimmy, but I'm just saying I've heard rumors of so many things over the past 3 years again, but you tolerate it as an organization if the guy is playing at a high level. They made concessions to Jimmy. They never made for LeBron, never made for Dwayne, never made for Zoe, never made for Timmy, never made for Goran, never made for Shaq. Okay, we're talking about, Hall of Fame level or close to Hall of Fame level players. They never made those concessions. They made them for Jimmy. And I'm not even talking about the stuff that was difficult behind the scenes. Jimmy stayed at different hotels on the road. I've never heard of Heat players doing that. Okay.
And would post on Instagram with them playing like cards and shit. You know what I mean? Like
decide. And again, I don't care about
without like not a lot of teammates hanging around them either, which I always found interesting.
Right. Well, and that's the
outside
other
of
thing.
certain occasions. But
That's the other thing. Well, Ron, sir, I would get into more of it again, but I like to get things totally validated, and a lot of this stuff's going to get played out. I just know
and a
I've
lot of it is also
some of
like,
it was teammate related lately too, from what I've heard. Okay, so
yeah.
there's a lot of stuff there. It was staffers. There's people who in the Heat organization have been there for 30 years, and they were miserable at times just dealing with, and some in various parts of the organization. People mentioned Jimmy in the team events. Okay, everybody made a big deal this year about how he missed the Christmas party at Riley's. Okay,
And
I think
everyone
he's
else
only been
went, right?
right, but the reason I downplayed it at the time was I think he's only made it to two. Now Kyle missed it last year, and it became this big deal because it was also when the swirl was going on with him. Jimmy didn't show up to Dwayne's stuff. Jimmy, that's just who he is. Meanwhile, it all always falls on Bam. Always. He's always there. And that's why they anointed, even though Jimmy was a better player, they anointed Bam the keeper of the culture. Udonis, Bosch, all these morning, like they anointed. I saw very positive interactions between Zoe and Jimmy, but like they anointed Bam as the guy to keep it. And the reason is because Jimmy just doesn't buy into some of that stuff. Fine. That's okay. If he's playing the way he was playing, you pay for that. Okay. You pay for that. You deal with it. And as Rohan said on our pod, it's a stars league. You play into that and all the rest of that. But when he's not playing, and that's what Pat was getting at. And it wasn't just Pat speaking for Pat. It was Pat speaking for not just for ownership, for coaches, for players, for teammates who wanted him to be there more consistently and more reliable. People, Daniel Firesword's asking, was Jimmy okay with Bam being captain? I don't think Jimmy was ever considered. I asked Bam at before they announced the captain at FAU in training camp last season. I said, "You're going to be the captain?" He says, "I guess. I don't know who else would do it." Now, again, he's not even the best player on the team. I don't know who else would do it. Okay.
I mean, it's
And so,
second best, to be fair. Like, I don't
right,
think captain is
I,
not always the best player on the team.
it's not always, but the fact that Jimmy was never even considered for it, again,
And
Jimmy,
it should be, but I totally get it. Here,
go ahead.
the other thing is, what I will like, because the front office is obviously like it's a big part of the discussion. Then I want to ask you the question here. 2023 offseason, I think where they fucked this up is, and I said this in the moment, when the Lillard thing fell apart,
Mhm.
and whether it caught them by surprise or not, whatever, but there was no pivot, and they kind of just went into training camp. And I think
They
that's
tried. They did try, but if you remember, there wasn't a lot there. Look,
they.
that
I know
situation,
they attempted Drew Holiday, but
they attempted
realistically, they
Drew.
weren't going to get Drew Holiday from Port. Like even if they did the Terry Rozier deal before the season started,
Mhm.
then and Terry Rozier at the time, I don't even know if he would have cost a first round pick because he wasn't playing the way he was last year in
Right.
Charlotte. And then
I
that
don't even
even
think he was a consideration at the time,
right.
and that
But
now that turned out to be a
somebody,
mistake.
the point is somebody, right? And they didn't
Right.
do like they kind of just went into camp like, all right, there's no
I think they
Dame.
were shell shocked, not by the Dame thing. Then again, the Dame thing dragged out.
But
Okay.
this front office should, I would argue, they shouldn't be shell shocked of all the front offices.
Right.
Like if they have
Well,
the institution that they've had,
and usually they do pivot. Like even when Dwayne
right?
left, remember they signed 6 players within like 30 minutes. I mean, unfortunately, one of them was Tyler Johnson on a re-signing. But yes, typically they do pivot. But I think what happened there, first thing, it wasn't just that Dame wasn't traded to them, which I think they'd kind of given up on at that point because they hadn't even
Heard
been
from
able to
them,
have communication with
right?
Cronin. Like when people are talking about like me and this, I got into this in the pod tonight, so we don't have to do it tonight. But there is a big difference. There's a lot of big differences between the Dame situation and the Jimmy situation. But okay, they couldn't even communicate with Cronin. He basically made a spiteful trade. All right. They had never dealt with anybody like Cronin ever, ever. Okay. They just didn't, it was so unprofessional and weird to them that he wouldn't at least engage them I mean, just at the very least to increase his offer from somebody else. Okay. Use the Heat as leverage. He didn't even do that. Right. Okay. And he ended up taking a garbage deal. But after that, then it was they weren't that upset about Dame getting traded in Milwaukee. I talked to them after that, and they thought that the Bucks got worse. I want to repeat that. They thought the Bucks got worse, and they were right. They were right.
Only because they got hurt at the end though. They would have beaten the Pacers, I think,
I
if they were
understand,
healthy.
but that Dame and Giannis had different numbers together. But the reality is, okay, they thought the Bucks got worse defensively. Drew had more in the tank ultimately in what he provides, and they were uncomfortable with and they were uncomfortable with the contract that was basically that Dame had. Okay, but were they willing to engage it? Yes. Okay, they would have talked about it. They would have seen what would happen. If retrospect, I don't know if even Tyler, Duncan, and 2 firsts would have been a good trade. I don't. Okay. Now that we see what Tyler's becoming and the fact that you have to deal with Dame as he declines with that contract. But I understood why you go in on it because you're trying to give Jimmy a chance and Dame and the relationship with Bam and all the rest of that. And Dame has proven at times to be a great playoff performer. So I get it. Okay. But okay. After that happened, the day they were upset was not Dame getting traded to Milwaukee. It was when Drew was traded to Boston. Mm-hmm. That's the day I talked to some people in there and they knew, okay, this is done now.
And they couldn't, they was there a plan at the time to pivot from even that? Was Jimmy pushing for something specific?
That I know Jimmy wanted Drew.
Did he want anybody else?
I know Jimmy wanted Drew, but I don't know how the Drew thing would have fit in Miami because he's not a great offensive player at this stage. And so you're basically, but they would have been,
he would have fit.
He would. They would have
played him at every fourth quarter for maybe all 12 minutes. Like he would have fit.
Well, and they would have leaned into the defense there with him, obviously, but it didn't end up happening. I do know that they inquired. I was told that they actually offered. They were not offered because they never got that far. Because again, it was Cronin. Sure. They were willing to offer more for Drew. I reported this at the time. Than for Dame.
Yeah. And Drew is ultimately the one who won the title.
They were willing to increase. They were willing to throw Caleb in on a deal there, where I don't think that he was necessarily in the mix on the Dame thing. So again, but we'll never know with the Dame thing because there was never any engagement. Okay, so again, getting back to this, we're like, okay, what could they have done to add to it? Okay, well, I mean, Boston outbid them. Cronin wasn't going to deal with them. And then what are they going to pivot to at this stage? I'm not saying, look, there are creative things they could have done that they didn't. And that's why we talk about, Boston getting Porzingis. I mean, you had to take a risk with Porzingis at that time. Okay, he'd been injury prone. There are other moves that I don't know about. The fans certainly don't know about that they likely could have made if they wanted to jump in. They were not going to go into the second apron.
And they're still
CBA
not.
Kind of,
also,
and they still won't.
Yeah.
The CBA kind of effed them in a bunch of different ways. So that's kind of where it's at. So basically, I say this: did the Heat bear some responsibility for not putting the best pieces around Jimmy? Yes, but
yes.
I'll get back to this.
Especially after the last finals run, because that's when it felt like Jimmy's peak would be starting to decline.
But they also last year they made the Rozier trade, which I know one person in the front office did not want to make, but they made. No, but it's not who you think. Okay, there was one person, and now they've since told him that he was right, but that's it.
All I'm gonna say about Terry Rozier is he was averaging 19, 4, and 4 before his neck started hurting, and he didn't play in the playoffs.
Well, he started to shoot the ball better after about the first 3 weeks.
After they finally got him a place to live. Yeah.
Daniel Firestorm asking which player to Pat apologize to Jimmy for not going. I'm not sure. I know that the players that Dame and Drew were two that I know were there. KD, KD is like that was something that they've pushed for many times, but they've been second every time. They were second in 2016 to the Warriors. They thought they had a long shot, and then Spo gave this incredible presentation that KD still raves about, and he thought about it, but he wasn't going to not go there instead of Golden State. But here's the thing about it, Brian. I just want to make this one point because I got into this with Evan when it comes to the players that they acquire. Because again, this is just about money. Let's just make it clear. This is about money.
Primarily about money, yes.
That's it, okay? If they'd given him his money, he wouldn't have cared who they acquired.
Right.
That's it. He would have thought, I'll drag them to the finals.
And if the Heat thought they were competitive enough, they probably should have given him the money to begin with.
And that's an argument that is reasonable to make. Like if you're like the halfway in thing, does not work.
2 years, but it was really 1 year. And
it was 1 year. You can absolutely make a case, okay, that they could have given him the money.